Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at Out Out by Robert Frost. This is a poem about a boy who is cutting wood with a spinning saw, and he accidentally puts his arm in the path of the saw and has to have his hand amputated. At the end of the poem he dies from this injury, but the people around him aren't very concerned about it, and immediately after they just get back to their normal lives. To summarize the emotional tone of the poem, I would say it's very shocking, horrifying, striking, disturbing, disgusting, heart-wrenching, creepy, painful, and chilling. Now we're going to walk through the poem line by line, and I'm going to start with the title, Out Out. So this is a reference to a quote from William Shakespeare's Macbeth. The quote is, "Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow." And this is a commentary on the pointlessness of life. And the purpose of it in this poem is to highlight the theme of human helplessness and our ultimate consumption by death. The quote is cut off, which mirrors not only the boy's hand being cut off in the poem, but also his life being cut short. So yeah, the purpose of this reference is to set up some of the themes of the poem and some of the emotional struggles that come with the subject matter. The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard, and made dust and dropped stone-length sticks of wood, sweet-scented stuff, when the breeze drew across it. Right, this poem does not hesitate to start with some literary devices. So we can see in the first few lines here, we've got an alliteration of S and onomatopoeia of buzz, snarl, rattled, and breeze. So all these things reflect the sound of the saw. We also have sensory engagement in the sweet-scented, and this is all to get a really vivid picture of the saw across immediately. Immediately we know that that is the main focus of this poem. And with the words snarled and rattled, it comes across as quite animalistic and quite snake-like. So there's already this sense of mystery and maybe creepiness around the saw. There's interesting phrasing in the second line here, because the saw is seen to make dust, and it also drops some bits of wood for the fire. So it's almost like its purpose is to make the dust, and it just happens to be making some sticks of wood as well, when obviously it's the other way round in reality. So this is already getting across a sense of negativity around the saw. Maybe it's displaying it as quite useless and clumsy, and this is going to play into the whole theme of anti-machinery and anti-industrialization as the poem goes on. And from there, those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset, far into Vermont. With the images of the mountain and the sunset, we're getting some natural imagery in the poem now, and the phrase, "those that lifted eyes," shows that humans are not aware of their surroundings. These people are actually working into the night, past sunset, and the beauty outside is begging to be known, but the people are just working too hard that they're not seeing it. They're no longer appreciating nature. And the saw snarled and rattled, as it ran light or had to bear a load. And nothing happened. Day was all but done. The repetition of snarled and rattled reflects how the saw is cutting repeatedly and relentlessly working. It's running light as it spins empty, and then it's bearing a load when it's slowed by the wood it's chopping. So this is the first time that the saw is personified, because we usually imagine people bearing loads. And this alludes to how the saw is a metaphor for hard work in this poem and for industrial labour of people. The phrase "nothing happened" is showing that everything is normal at this point. Nothing is out of the ordinary. And then there's alliteration of D in "day was all but done," and that gives a sense of finality and firmness. "Call it a day, I wish they might have said, to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work." This is the first time that the boy character of the poem is mentioned, and that's in line 11, so it's pretty clear that the saw is the main focus of this poem. The regret of the narrator foreshadows how something bad is going to happen, and by setting it up as something sad, we feel empathy for this boy before we even see what happened to him. Then there's the colloquial phrase, call it a day. And this familiar personal language is used a lot in association with the boy. And I'll talk a lot about that later on. But another thing to point out here is that his youth is highlighted through his exaggerated reluctance to work, because he feels he's being saved from working if he gets just half an hour off. So yeah, these lines are really setting up a sense of empathy for this boy, a sense of his youth and innocence. His sister stood beside them in her apron to tell them, "Supper." At the word, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leapt out at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. However it was, neither refused the meeting. But the hand. The character of the sister here implies a solidarity between siblings and perhaps a detachment from the older generation who are forcing these characters to work. She is in her apron, which is one of the many simple and picturesque country images that really sets the scene in this poem. Now it's interesting that it says she tells them that it's supper, and this could be referring to the boy and other workers in the shed or wherever he is, or it could be an extension of the personification of the saw. So she's telling the saw and the boy that it's supper. It's not really explained. So this is almost creepy to me, how much the saw and the boy seem to be like one in the same. There's this blur between man and machine, and we're not really sure which is which. And it's not really clear how much the saw has human qualities or how much we're just assigning that to it. So it raises the question of, when we use tools, do we become instruments ourselves? Evidence of this is the line, "as if to prove," and that reflects how the boy is a beginner in the workplace and he has something to prove. So again, there's this parallel between the saw and the boy, and it just creeps me out. Further blurring between them is in who is to blame for the accident. Logically, the boy put his hand in the way of the saw, but the narrator again hints at a darker nature of the saw by suggesting that it was at fault. He doesn't outright say that the saw is evil, though, or even that the saw has consciousness, because that wouldn't be nearly as unsettling. He's really leaving us unsure, and he's leaving us to make conclusions ourselves and really think about the nature of machinery and what we're becoming by using machinery. So the one moment that this accident happens is given 4 lines in the poem. So it's the last 3 lines of what we're looking at here, and also the next line of the next part of the poem. So that really shows the intensity of this moment and draws out the horror that we feel on witnessing it. The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. The boy laughing after such a horrific thing has happened is shocking to the reader, which gives us a sense of the shock he is obviously feeling after this has happened. So it's a very emotional sequence at this point of the poem. We've been calm, and then we went straight into this horror, and then to this shock, and now we're feeling pity for the boy who is pleading to the people around him. And again, there's this ambiguity in the them. He could be turning to the other workers, if there are other workers here, or to his family, or to his sister and the saw. Maybe that's the them. Again, it's just left as this mystery. There's interesting diction in the word life instead of blood when it says the life from spilling. So that really shows how serious this injury is. And there's a double consonant sound of life and then from. So we go straight from an F to another F. So this creates a pause or caesura, as we like to call it in poetry for some reason, to make us linger on this really intense moment. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know, big boy, doing a man's work, though a child at heart. He saw all spoiled. "Don't let him cut my hand off. The doctor, when he comes, don't let him, sister." So, but the hand was gone already. Some really interesting word choice in this part of the poem. We have big boy, which is another colloquial and endearing way of referring to the boy. Then we have spoiled, which means that it's ruined beyond repair, so it's quite a strong adjective to use. Then we have dialogue, which is used to directly convey this boy's terror, and his repetition of "don't let him" shows his desperation and pain in this moment. And then there's the single word "so" directly after his dialogue, and this gives a sense of finality and the harsh reality of the situation, because it's a really blunt one-word sentence. So this cuts off the boy's speech, just like he just cut off his hand. And the next line is just as impersonal, with a hollow, matter-of-fact tone that's really quite brutal for the situation. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath. And then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They all listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing. And that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. Ether is an early form of painkillers, and the way that the boy is sent into the dark implies that he's going towards death, so we already sort of know what's coming. I find the word watcher really interesting because it's such an impersonal title for the person who's checking whether he's still alive, and again, it's left us to decide who these people around him are. Lines 31 and 32 have half-length sentences which up the pace of his death and mirror the boy's heartbeat dwindling away. His moment of death is actually described in 3 words. So the long moment we saw earlier of him touching the saw is definitely the standout moment of the poem. That is what is emphasized as the moment of his downfall. So I think Frost was trying to make sure that the focus is on the saw and how that caused his death. The phrase "that ended it" is some more very industrial and emotionless description, and the phrase "no more to build on there" is even more callous. So the word "build" is very interesting, and I think this emphasizes the purpose of this lack of sympathy in the writing. So it's showing how in modern society, the boy is only as good as his work. So there being nothing left to build on mirrors how he can no longer build anything, so he's no longer useful. The repetition of the word "they" and its position at the end of the second to last line emphasize this word and the ambiguity of it, and again, we have to wonder who these people are, especially before the final line, which shows these people heartlessly turning away from the boy and getting back to their work. So I think this is kept vague so that we are forced to think about it and think about who would do this and think about whether maybe even we would do this. And I also think it allows Frost to refer to like the whole of society. He's not pinning it down to how families have been changed by industrialization or how men or workers or anything like that. It's just them. It's just all people. Alright, let's discuss the form of this poem. So it's written in blank verse or unrhymed iambic pentameter, and I'm just going to list loads of literary devices used. So we have alliteration of S and onomatopoeia of buzz, snarl, rattled and breeze, which all reflect the sound of the saw and immediately get across this vivid picture of this piece of machinery. There is alliteration further on as well in the phrase "day was all but done," which gives a sense of finality and firmness. Then there is personification of the saw in how it bears a load, which is usually something that people would do. So the saw becomes a metaphor for people's hard work and their industrial labour. There's repetition of snarled and rattled, which emphasises the animalistic nature of the saw and reflects how it works relentlessly. Repetition is used again later on when the boy repeats "don't let him," showing his desperation and fear. Then we have colloquial phrases such as "call it a day," "supper," and "big boy," which contrast with the hard impersonal machinery and the new attitudes emerging in society in contrast to this familiar country humble life. There's also foreshadowing in the poem with the narrator saying "I wish they might have said," and put him in the dock. So we feel sad for the boy before we even know what happens. So it's really emphasizing what emotional reaction Frost is trying to get us to feel as we read the poem. There are 4 lines to drag out the intensity of the single moment in which the boy cuts his arm. And that is in contrast to the very short sentences and quick pace of his death. So we can see that the moment where he cuts his hand on the saw is the focus. That's the really important bit. And the stilted rhythm and half sentences later on show the suddenness of his death and how quickly people move on from it. So it's almost like once he's died, he's no longer important. So that's why that bit is sort of rushed over. Then there's loads of really interesting diction and really powerful words used. So we have life instead of blood when it says the life from spilling. And that shows how serious his injury is. It's life-threatening. Then there's the word prove when we're talking about the saw trying to prove that it knows what supper means, which draws a parallel between the saw and the boy, because the boy is presumably quite a new worker and he's trying to prove himself. Watcher is a very impersonal way of talking about the people around the boy when he dies. So that gives us insight into the attitude of the people around him. Then there's nothing to build on, showing how the boy was only valued for the work he could do, because there's sort of a double meaning in the word build. It's referring to how he spent his life building and now he can't do that. There's nothing left to build on. Then there's the word laugh for the boy's reaction to his injury, which provides shock for the audience and shows the boy's shock on the pain he feels. And finally, there's the ambiguity of them, which makes us think about who would do this, who would react to a death like this. So it really makes the reader think and also allows Frost to make sweeping statements about the whole of society or about whatever the reader would find most impactful. So from the horror that we feel of this poem, we're probably going to fill in the blank with whatever would be most horrifying to us. So I think that's why a lot of people assume that the them around him are his family, because that would horrify a lot of people. But yeah, Frost leaves it open in case you have a more horrifying conclusion that you might draw from it. Then there's caesura. Still don't know how to pronounce that. In the life from spilling, which emphasizes the very important moment of his hand bleeding out and him pleading with people around him to help him. Finally, the title quote is cut off, and in the same way the boy's dialogue is cut off with the simple word so. And this reflects how the boy cut off his hand and how his life was cut short. So there is a running theme throughout the poem of things being unfinished and a regret in reaction to this. Quickly, I want to talk about the characterization of the boy. He is very innocent and he is portrayed very sympathetically, even though it was technically his own actions that caused the accident that caused his death. So he is contrasted with the vicious animalistic saw and the hardened older generation, which force him to work long hours and which don't care if he dies. Another way his innocence and the empathy we should feel towards him is emphasized is in the familiar affection that is used to describe him. So we have phrases like big boy and child at heart, and there's also personal colloquial phrases associated with him, such as call it a day, saved from work, and supper. Then we have the representation of the saw. So there's a really interesting blur in this poem between man and machine, which creates an underlying uncertainty about what we're actually reading about. So the saw is personified in the way that it ran light or had to bear a load, and comes across as quite animalistic, quite vicious and scheming in the way that it snarled and rattled, and the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped out. So there's a contrast with the very innocent boy, and from an outside perspective, I would say they could even be seen as enemies, but when you really dig deep into the poem, you can see that they are interwoven in this really interesting way. They're often talked about as them, and the gruesome accident is a meeting which neither refused. They're both trying to do the same job. They're both worn down by hard work, as we see in the saw having to bear a load, and they're both trying to prove something. So you can see here that there's loads of parallels between them. They seem like partners in this weird way. It's very hard to describe, but there's something elusive about them. It's almost like the saw is like a shadow of the boy. I don't really know. I'm making this up as I go along. But anyway, this makes the poem quite disturbing, and it's definitely not as simple as good versus evil or people versus machines, because machines didn't just come and invade society. We created them and we use them. So the poem is not just condemning industrial systems, but the attitudes and lifestyles that have come along with it. So Frost is saying the problem is inside of us, which makes this quite a psychologically focused and penetrating poem. It really makes you think about yourself rather than just saying, oh, machines are so bad and we should run away from them. You really have to think about how you act and how using machines can actually change who we are as a species almost. It's pretty deep. It's pretty deep. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this video by talking about how this poem discusses industrialization. So Frost often writes about modernist themes from a romanticist perspective, and that's to say he's often negative towards modernization and industrialization. However, this is one of his most outright anti-industrialism poems, in my opinion. We get a real sense of the horrors that machinery can cause and the deep regret that he feels about it. He actually talks directly in this poem from a first-person perspective, saying he wishes that things could have been different. Early on in the poem, there is natural imagery, which contrasts with the mechanical images of the saw. And Frost highlights how we are disconnected from nature by how hard we work and how much we value productivity now. So he says, those that lifted eyes could see the beautiful sunset. The saw, trying to prove it knows what supper meant, creates another sort of juxtaposition between family life and industrial machinery, and highlights how they don't naturally fit together. However, at the same time, the saw and the boy are blurred together, highlighting how industrialization is not something happening completely outside of us. It's affecting us psychologically as well, and affecting how we live our lives. And Frost is just really trying to get you to think about that. So yeah, we could summarize this poem as a commentary on the loss of empathy and humanity in an industrialized world. It focuses in on children who are forced to grow up quickly and how people are becoming like machines. This poem was written in 1916, obviously during World War I, so it could be alluding to World War I and how kids signed up to fight really young and sadly had to leave their childhood behind. Obviously, it doesn't directly allude to this, but it's a possible interpretation of some of the things Frost was trying to point out about our society.